Shalom, shalom, Boker Tov. Excited to learn some Sefer HaChinuch with you, in particular one of my favorite mitzvot. Here, mitzvah 611 out of 613, of course, the Taryag mitzvot, that the Sefer mitzvot, based on the Rambam, is working through the 613 mitzvot as they go through the Torah portions. And 611 is Halachte Bedrachav. Mitzvah lehidamot b'darchei Hashem yitbarach hatovim v'hayesharim. Halachte Bedrachav. That we should emulate or imitate God's ways. And this is learned from Deuteronomy 28:9, that we should walk in God's ways, v'halachte Bedrachav, and also in Deuteronomy 10:12, lalechet b'chol drachav, that we should emulate God's ways. And now the Rambam is explicit over in Sefer HaMitzvot, mitzvah number 8, that this is deraita, that this is a biblical commandment on the same level as all other biblical mitzvot, that we should emulate God's ways. Now this is fascinating and powerful because it doesn't specify all the various types of ethical commitments we have throughout our days, but rather that we should be just and good and compassionate all the time. And that itself is a highest biblical priority, and thus it has to be accounted for. If anything else that appears to be a command or a necessity appears to contradict the compassionate ways of God. So the Sefer HaChinuch says over here, Shenitz tavinu lasot kol ma'aseinu b'derech hayosher hatov vehatov b'chol kochenu ulahatov kol devareinu asher beinenu uvein zulatenu al derech hachesed veharachamim. Right? That we are commanded to perform all of our actions in a way of honesty and of goodness, with all of our energy, all of our power, and to channel all of our situations that are between us and others with a way of kindness and compassion, with a way of chesed v'rachamim, everything yosher v'tov. And then we see here in Chazal, in the rabbis, if you look at Sota 14a, or the Sifrei, Deuteronomy 49, or Midrash Tanayim from Deuteronomy 11:22, we see here that this applies to all types of situations. The Sefer HaChinuch here says, Ma HaKadosh Baruch Hu Nikra Rachum Afatahaya Rachum. That just as God is called compassionate, so too we need to act compassionate. Ma HaKadosh Baruch Hu Nikra Chanun Afatahaya Chanun. That just as HaKadosh Baruch Hu is gracious, so too we must be gracious. Ma HaKadosh Baruch Hu Nikra Tzadik Afatahaya Tzadik. Just as HaKadosh Baruch Hu is just, so too we must act with a commitment towards social justice, towards justice in all practices, as God does. Afatahaya Mahu Nikra Kadosh Afatahaya Kadosh. Just as God is holy, so too we should strive to be holy. We should be merciful, we should be kind, we should be compassionate, we should be just, we should be holy. And so this is actually the idea of what would God do, so to speak, and that we are bound. And if someone asked me, what is the foundation of Jewish ethics, I would probably put this as primary. That the primary Jewish ethic is halachte bedrachav. That we are always told to take the higher road, to emulate the divine path towards compassion. Now let's bracket the theological dilemma that today God does not appear to interact with the world in the way that God appears to have acted in the world in prior generations. So today we cannot see the compassionate hand of God in all matters, as prior generations may have been able to see. So we have two ideas. One is to look back at traditional texts to see how God acts in certain scenarios. And secondly, is to engage the highest level of empathy, to understand the foundation of love and kindness that God carries into the world, and as a thought experiment, as an understanding, to emulate that. Now, Rabbi Yitzchak Blau says something very interesting. He writes about the Jewish virtue ethic. And in the Jewish virtue ethic, it's not consequentialist. We don't do the good just to maximize the consequence of the most good. It's also not deontological about our duties, but it is primarily about cultivating virtue within us. I do the good, halachta bedrachav, imitati odei, in order to emulate God, and in order to not only fulfill this mitzvah, but to become a virtuous person myself. Now that's very interesting. So Rabbi Blau asks over there, good, I see a question coming in. I'll return to this in just a moment. If he asks over there, is it better to do what God does for the sake, because God does it? Right? Does that mean to emulate God means I do good because God does good? And I want to emulate God? He says, no, it's the opposite. God doesn't do good. God does good because it's good itself. So he argues that a Jewish virtue ethic is that one does good not because God does good, but one does good for its own sake. And that is the highest level of halachta b'drachav, that we emulate God most closely when we do what's good for its own sake, not because we're commanded and not because God does it, but in fact we are doing it in the way that God does it by doing it for its own sake itself. Now Rav Kook has an interesting point here, right? I'll post the sources below. Rav Kook says, we have a Talmudic idea that gadol mitzvah over gadol eino mitzvah. It's better to do something we're commanded in than to do something for its own sake or because it's good. Now Rav Kook says, that applies to ritual but not to ethical laws. Over with ritual, you might be building a sukkah because it's fun or because it's nice, but rather the higher level to do it is to fulfill the mitzvah itself. But when it comes to something ethical, we strive to become virtuous people, to cultivate empathy, to spread loving kindness and justice in the world, and we do it for that sake itself. And that is the higher level than doing it because we're commanded. The commanded is a lower level to do it when it comes to the ethical commandment. Now, I see there's a question here. Avi, if God acts today in the world with indifference, how can he blame us if we act that way ourselves? Okay, so that's a complicated theological question. And I'm not sure if that was based upon something I said or if it's your assumption that God acts with indifference. What I would want to suggest is that in many ways, as we learn from Hasidic thinkers, and feel free to comment more here, Avi, that there's a process of tzimtzum, and here I'll channel my teacher, Rabbi Yitz Greenberg, as well, that in tzimtzum, God steps back from the world and continues as we mature in society and as human beings to step back more and more. So it's not that there's indifference from God, but rather it's a liberation theology. We seek to liberate God, and God cries along with us when God cannot intervene. But we are to emulate the type of God that does intervene. It's a great question, because if God is not interacting with the world, how can we be accountable to not do those things as well if we're supposed to be emulating God? So I think that here we are to emulate the God project, the God idea, so to speak, of what it means to be godly, because we cannot see God's hand in the world in that same kind of way. But we can rely upon the text in learning how God has interacted with the world in the past, and we can engage in thought experiments of what the highest ethical good is, and to emulate that. In fact, this might go even further than the ethical realm. So at the very least, we can say anything that feels like we're commanded that is not good, we've misunderstood it. We can't do something that we think we're commanded in if it's actually not good for the world. That would be some kind of religious fundamentalism. Rabbi Sadia Goen says, if you think you're commanded in something unethical, you've mistaken. Either go back and study your ethics, understand your worldly wisdom, and maybe you got that wrong, or go back to the text and retranslate it because maybe you got the text wrong. So we cannot just merely engage in blind submission. We learn this from Avraham Avinu, from Abraham, that we challenge God. We challenge the text, and we see this throughout the Chumash, that we need to not just submit, but actually cultivate our morality and make sure that the halakha itself is moral. Okay, Avi's got a follow-up. I guess the question is, how is the terminology halachta b'drachav when God's drachav are something we ostensibly shouldn't be emulating today? It's a great question, and I think the question is stronger than my answer, because I think the question is, when we see a God, and he says, wouldn't or shouldn't the terminology or philosophy behind the mitzvah have to change once God removes God's self? Great question. So, right, one could say that once we see a God who does not intervene, doesn't that loosen the grips of this mitzvah to say that the divine model is the one to emulate? Which is a great point. Perhaps we need to emulate role models more and engage in a different type of project to uncover the highest ethical. And I think that that's actually fair. I think that whatever means we come to discover the most ethical, we can connect that back to halachta b'dracha. For example, if I cultivate my conscience, I can understand that conscience, obeying that conscience to be a fulfillment of emulating the divine ways. Or if I engage in a philosophical project, whether it's consequentialist or deontological or whatever the project is, that in doing that, I can then attach that to halachta b'dracha. Because essentially what we're saying is the best good as I can understand it, when I pursue that, I'm emulating God's ways, even though we don't see God intervening in the world in that kind of way today. Now, it's very possible that God is intervening in that way in a hidden type of fashion, that every birth of a child is the compassionate work of a creator, that every good that happens, our heart beating every moment, and every act of kindness is in fact a divine intervention. This is very possible. But for those of us who don't hold that theology and actually believe that God put nature in place and take a more Maimonidean approach, and that God has stepped away, then it's true. We're not emulating the God as we see it today. And thus, one could argue that this mitzvah doesn't apply in its traditional form, or that it applies in a lesson form. But I actually think the mitzvah is so crucial as a counterweight to a notion of submission that I think it needs to be reframed. Because here's another reframing. We see a God act with anger in the text. And the Midrash says, no, only obey, only follow and emulate God's just and compassionate ways. Don't emulate the ways that seem to be more gevura, more based in strength or in anger or in punishment. That's not for us to do. And so we already say, okay, maybe not every way that God intervenes with the world is a way we want to do that. Avi writes more, perhaps the best good we can do is the good we can do without possibly accepting the credit for it, just as God does today. Beautiful point, right? That perhaps it is halachta b'drachav to be doing good in a way where we get no credit for it, because in fact God is doing good in the world in ways we can't even see it, and all this. So all the more so to truly emulate. It's a great chiddush. That's a great point, Avi. To truly fulfill halachta b'drachav in the deepest sense today, we fulfill that by doing good in a way that others can't tell that it's us doing it. Doing the anonymous act is the highest form of fulfilling the emulation of the Hester Panim, that God is nistar, that God intervenes in the world in hidden ways, and we emulate that when we do good in this kind of way. Now, so it's a great point. One final point here, unless there's any other folks who weigh in here, is a point from Rabbi Soloveitchik. Now, we might think this only applies to the big ethical moments in our life. Hold on, Avi's got something else. Or doing good that others don't care for, won't give you credit for, such as not eating meat. Great point. Right. That actually, when sometimes we do good, others will view it as bad. That's an even more interesting point, right? That someone says, "Oh, you don't get it, right? You're, in Avi's point here, you're refraining from eating meat. You don't get it. Humans are higher than animals, and you're confusing the hierarchy. Or you Jews, engage in X, Y, and Z, and you don't understand, what our faith understands, whatever the case is. And in fact, that when we do that form of good, and we're criticized for it, it's even better, because God is criticized today for being absent, for being silent. And so it's all the better. Wonderful insights there. Okay, so now as our final point, unless anyone else weighs in here, that we might think halachta b'drachav only applies to those big ethical moments where we are commanded to be compassionate and just and holy and take the high road. Because what it means to be a holy person, a divine-like being, is not just to fulfill obligations. and not just to do what everyone else does in the world, but rather to always take the high road, to ask myself, what as Christians say, what would Jesus do? But in Jewish language, what would God do? What would God do in such a moment if God interacted in the world in a way that we do? And so I want to take the high road and go above and beyond. Now, it doesn't just apply to this. Rabbi Soloveitchik says this also applies to our happiness in the world, to our leisure. He brings a source from the Talmud, Avodah Zarah 3b, which is a comical Talmudic text that says, during the first 3 hours of every day, God sits and involves God's self in Torah study. During the second 3 hours of the day, God sits and judges the entire world. During the third 3-hour period of the day, God sits and provides nourishment for the entire world. During the fourth 3-hour period, God sits and amuses God's self with this massive sea creature we call the Leviathan. And Rabbi Joseph B. Soloveitchik here says, over in Nefesh Harav, where it's quoted, is that it says the Talmud describes God as spending a portion of the day in amusement with this gigantic fish in order to teach us that a religious Jew should not always be so serious and heavy-headed. Now, of course, of these 24-hour period, 21 hours is pretty serious, right, of the type of good we try to do in the world. Yes, and thank you for Christo, of what Muslim friends would say also. And we wish, a meaningful Ramadan and to our Muslim friends. That 21 hours is very serious, fulfilling our responsibility in the world. But there is this other issue of playfulness and of happiness and of joy, which can be infused into all that, but emulating God, playing with this sea creature. That sometimes those of us most serious about our moral responsibility and perpetuating justice and holiness into the world can find ourselves without the ability to cultivate simcha, joy, in our lives. And so God plays with this gigantic fish, the rabbis imagine, in a way that we too should ensure that we have leisure and joy in our life as well. So to sum up here, we see that mitzvah 611 in the Sefer HaChinuch is halachta b'drachav, imitatio yodei, lelechet b'chol drachav, inspired by Micha, also Micha 7:18, ki chafetz chesed, that God loves love and God loves kindness. And so in all of our ways, we should ask ourselves, what will I do today to not only do what is right and good and just, but to become a person who is good and just? And that every moment of our day is an opportunity to work on ourselves. What an exciting opportunity, right? That we're not in the world just to make money. We're not in the world just to fulfill our egos. We're not in the world just to have fun and be happy. We're not even just in the world to fulfill obligations. We are here in the world on the highest level to become godly beings, to actualize our tselem Elokim, our inner godliness, to be actualized. And that is not prescribed in the minutia, whereas other parts of Shabbat or Kashrut or other issues are prescribed in the minutia. Here it is very open. What would God do? What does it mean to be godly in this moment? And as we saw from the Jewish virtue ethic principle, that means doing it for its own sake. I do the good here, not just because it makes me good, not only because it's a mitzvah, not only because God does it, but because it itself is good. We want to be a person who runs after the good. May we all be blessed each day to have on our agenda, our daily agenda, not only a to-do list, but a to-be list, right? A to-be list of what do I seek to be today, and how can I ultimately fulfill that in a way that brings repair to the world, honor to God, and an actualization of our unique soul. Have a wonderful day.